Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series in which we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the attack-focused barbarian, Wulfgar of Icewind. Before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what commanders you can vote for in the comments for an upcoming episode. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Wulfgar of Icewind is a 4/4 human barbarian that costs 3, a red and a green, has melee, and the following ability. If a creature you control attacking would cause a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Sporting a mid-size CMC and stat line, Wulfgar's keyword and ability makes it clear that he's a combat-oriented commander that cares about turning both himself and our creatures sideways to get maximum value out of their attacks. Looking further in depth into his ability, clearly any creatures that have a printed attack trigger will benefit from it, getting 2 triggers for the price of 1 per swing. But it's not just printed attack triggers that benefit from it, as there's plenty of keywords that, due to triggering upon the declare attacker step when the creature swings in, also get doubled up by our commander. Melee, for example, which our commander has himself, will double up to give the creature a +2/+2 bonus per opponent attacked. Battle Cry gives a board-wide +2/+0 to all our attacking creatures. Myriad would double up the amount of tokens created, and Annihilator is particularly nasty by sacking double the amount of permanents, all of which greatly expand the use of our commander's ability outside of just printed effects. With that in mind, the build we'll be focusing on today will be a combat-focused one, in which we will aim to dominate the combat phase as best we can. To do this, we'll need a large creature base, most of which will possess combat-focused abilities and keywords to take maximum advantage of our commander's effect, providing us with both general benefits such as draw, ramp, and removal to keep our deck running smoothly, as well as combat-oriented effects such as token creation, AoE pump effects, and block prevention to ensure our creatures hit hard and sustain minimal casualties as they swing in. But just having creatures is only half the battle, as we'll need to make sure that they're able to get stuck in as quickly as possible and get through blockers that we can't bypass. So to ensure this happens, we'll be running a decent amount of haste and trample enablers to make sure that our creatures don't waste precious time with summoning sickness and can crash through our opponent's blockers with ease. Finally, since this deck is geared towards combat, it only makes sense that we try to be in it as often as possible. So we'll be running a number of effects that grant us additional combat phases to get even more value out of our attacks, both from our effects and the amount of damage we'll be able to pour into our opponent's life totals. So let's make sure our weapons are sharp, our armor is hard, and our fury is overwhelming, because we're about to take the fight to our opponents, and with Wulfgar at the helm, it's bound to be a bloodbath. So now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Starting in the CMC 1 slot, we have its only entry with Frenzied Goblin, a 1/1 that, whenever it attacks, lets us pay a red to prevent target creature from blocking that turn, giving us a low-cost body that we can drop early and prevent blockers from intercepting our attacks and killing our creatures. Some more attackers then join us in the CMC 2 slot with Battle Cry Goblin, Werewolf Pack Leader, and Targnar Demon Fang Gnoll. Battle Cry Goblin is a 2/2 with Pack Tactics, generating us a 1/1 tapped and attacking goblin when we swing in with it and at least 6 power worth of creatures, as well as letting us pay 1 and a red to pump all our goblins by +1/+0, providing us with another early drop to get some extra bodies on board and then a mana sink later to make those bodies and itself bigger when they swing in. Werewolf Pack Leader is a 3/3 with Pack Tactics that allows us to draw a card when we attack, and we can pay 3 and a green to turn it into a 5/3 Trampler, making it a good offensive form of card advantage that we can make bigger if needed. Targnar is a 2/2 with Pack Tactics that grants all attacking creatures +1/+0 when it swings in, and we can pay 2, a red and a green to double its power and toughness, generating a Battle Cry-like effect to pump all our attacking creatures and allowing us to grow him at instant speed if we need that extra reach. A trio of ramp creatures then closes out this slot with Goblin Anarchomancer, Sakura Tribe-Elder, and Radha Heir to Keld. Goblin Anarchomancer is a 2/2 that reduces the cost of all our red or green spells by 1, giving us a serviceable amount of early cost reduction for the vast majority of our deck. Sakura Tribe-Elder is a 1/1 that we can sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, providing us with some staple green land ramp on a body to trigger any creature payoffs we may have in play. Radha is a 2/2 that generates us 2 red mana when it swings or can be tapped for a green, making her a good attack-focused ramp source when blockers are down or a standard mana dork when they aren't. Moving on to the CMC 3 slot, we have some legends with Krenko 10th Street Kingpin, Layla the Blade Reforged, and Tuya Bearclaw. Krinko is a 1/2 who, when he attacks, gets a +1/+1 counter and then creates 1/1s equal to his power, working very well alongside our commander to grow quickly and flood the board with tokens as he does so. Layla is a 2/2 with haste that exiles the top card of our deck when she attacks, letting us play that card until the end of the turn, and gains a +1/+1 counter every time one or more of our cards are exiled from our deck or grave, providing us some attack-oriented impulse draw on another body that just keeps growing as we continue to swing in with it. Tuya Bearclaw is a 2/2 that gains +X/+X whenever it attacks, X being equal to the greatest power among creatures we control, turning herself into a huge threat every time she swings in alongside our commander or other high-powered creatures. Then closing out this slot, we have a pair of red creatures with Clamor Shaman and Coastline Marauders. Clamor Shaman is a 1/1 with Riot that prevents target creature from blocking when it attacks, giving us some nice flexibility by having it come in with haste or a +1/+1 counter when it ETBs thanks to Riot, and shutting down blockers so that our attackers can get through our opponent's front lines without any issues. Coastline Marauders is a 0/3 with trample that gains +1/+0 when it attacks for every land the defending player controls, as well as having Encore for 4 and double red, making it a decently sized threat that scales well with our opponent's land count and becomes terrifying in the late game when encored back for a potentially huge amount of damage alongside our commander. We then open up the CMC4 slot with some red creatures, those being Delina Wildmage, Goblin Heel Cutter, and Goblin Trap Runner. Delina is a 3/2 that, whenever she attacks, chooses a creature we control and rolls a d20. On a 1-14, she creates a non-legendary copy of that creature that's tapped and attacking, which is exiled at the end of combat, and on a 15+, she does the same and rolls again, giving us at least one free copy of our biggest body whenever we swing in, and potentially more if we get lucky. Goblin Heel Cutter is a 3/2 with dash for 2 and a red that prevents target creature from blocking when it attacks, giving us another creature that prevents chump blocking or trades when we swing in, and even gives us the option to make it hasty by casting it for its dash cost, though we would need to bounce it back to hand at the end of the turn. Goblin Trap Runner is a 4/2 that, whenever it attacks, flips 3 coins and creates a 1/1 tapped and attacking token for each one we call right, usually netting us 1 to 2 extra bodies per swing and double that alongside our commander for some decent, if unreliable, token generation. Moving deeper into this slot, we have a few more red creatures with Hero of Oxid Ridge, Ogre Battle Driver, and Tectonic Giant. Hero of Oxid Ridge is a 4/2 with haste and battle cry that prevents creatures with power 1 or less from blocking the turn it attacks, serving as a decent AoE pump effect for our creatures while simultaneously preventing them from being chumped by small tokens and the like. Ogre Battle Driver is a 3/3 that, whenever one of our creatures ETBs, grants them +2/+0 and haste until the end of the turn, ensuring that they're able to swing in as soon as they hit the board and even allowing them to temporarily hit harder when they do so. Tectonic Giant is a 4/3 that, whenever it attacks or is targeted by an opponent's spell, either deals 3 damage to each opponent or exiles the top 2 cards of our deck, letting us pick one which we can then play until the end of our next turn, providing us with a respectable amount of impulse draw with additional time to play the exiled card, as well as a potent AoE burn per swing if needed, both of which become even better when doubled up. Some green creatures then join us with Beast Whisperer and Fangren Firstborn. Beast Whisperer is a 2/3 that draws us a card whenever we cast a creature spell, serving as a potent source of repeatable card draw that takes advantage of our large creature base. Fangren Firstborn is a 4/2 that gives all our attacking creatures a +1/+1 counter every time it attacks, making it a superb way to permanently pump our board that synergizes well with our aggressive playstyle. Then we close out this slot with a pair of Gruul creatures with Grand Warlord Rada and Rubble Belt Raiders. This version of Rada is a 3/4 with haste that, whenever one or more of our creatures attacks, adds that same amount of green or red mana to our mana pool, which is not lost until the end of the turn, making her a superb source of ramp on established board states to fuel some of our bigger spells after we attack. Rubble Belt Raiders is a 3/3 that, whenever it attacks, gains a +1/+1 counter for each attacking creature, giving us another threat that keeps getting larger and larger as we continue to swing in turn after turn. Next up is the CMC5 slot, starting us off with some green entrants with Blossoming Bogbeast, Cultivator of Blades, and Kessiga Cagebreakers. Blossoming Bogbeast is a 3/3 that, whenever it attacks, gains us 2 life, then grants all our creatures +X/+X and trample until end of turn, X being equal to the amount of life we gained that turn, making it a decent enough overrun effect on its own, but being absolutely devastating alongside our commander for a board-wide +6/+6 and trample every time it swings in. Cultivator of Blades is a 1/1 with Fabricate 2 that, whenever it attacks, grants all attacking creatures +X/+X until end of turn, X being equal to its power. Being similar to the previous entry minus the trample, but can still grant a board-wide +3/+3 thanks to its 2+1/+1 counters generated by Fabricate 2, and buffing that to a +6/+6 alongside our commander. Casting a Cage Breakers is a 3/4 that, whenever it attacks, creates a 2/2 that's tapped and attacking for every creature in our graveyard, allowing us to rebuild our board state after a wipe alongside our haste enablers, or simply build up our board state even further in the late game after some of our creatures have been dealt with. The latter half of this slot then gives us some red entries with Flame Rush Rider, Grotag Thrasher, and Lightning Runner. Flame Rush Rider is a 3/3 with dash for 2 and double red that creates a tapped and attacking copy of another attacking creature whenever it attacks, which is exiled at the end of the combat phase, like the Lina before her, granting us another copy of the biggest attacker per swing for that extra reach. Grotag Thrasher is a 3/3 that prevents a creature from blocking whenever it attacks, giving us another way to bypass blockers as we continue to swing in. Lightning Runner is a 2/2 with double strike and haste that generates 2 energy every time it swings, then allows us to pay 8 energy to untap all our creatures and take an additional combat phase after this one, working spectacularly with Wulfgar to grant us an additional combat phase every round after the first, so long as it keeps swinging in. The CMC 6 slot is up next, starting us off with some huge bodies in the form of Kogla the Titan Ape, Etali Primal Storm, and Inferno Titan. Kogla is a 7/6 that fights a target creature when it ETBs, destroys an artifact or enchantment the defending player owns when it attacks, and lets us pay 1 and a green to return a human back to our hand and grants itself indestructible until end of turn, making it a potent combination of big stats, good removal, and the ability to protect both itself and our commander from removal and wipes at a negligible cost. Etali is a 6/6 that exiles the top card of each player's deck whenever it attacks, and allows us to cast any spells exiled this way for free, providing us with a terrifying creature that can get us between 4 and even 8 free spells per swing alongside our commander, as well as benefiting greatly from our haste enablers to have it swing in as quickly as possible. Inferno Titan is another 6/6, this time dealing 3 damage every time it attacks, divided up between up to 3 targets, and also allowing us to pay a red to give it +1/+0 until end of turn, making it a repeatable source of removal to deal with creatures and planeswalkers, or just to burn players if there are no other targets available. Then we're also running Savage Ventmaw, a 4/4 flyer that generates 3 red and 3 green mana whenever it attacks, preventing said mana from being lost until the end of the turn, giving us a huge spike of mana on its own and a whopping 12 mana alongside our commander to pump into our payoffs or to cast more spells after it manages to swing in. Finally, we end this slot with a pair of extra combat phase enablers with Hellkite Charger and Morag, Fury of Akum. Hellkite Charger is a 5/5 flyer with haste that, whenever it attacks, lets us pay 5 and double red to untap all our creatures and have an additional combat phase after this one, being serviceable on its own, but potentially generating us infinite combat turns alongside our commander and Savage Ventmaw to close out games for us. Morag is a 6/6 that grants each creature +1/+0 for every time it has attacked this turn, and whenever we play a land on our main phase, gives us an additional combat phase and untaps all our creatures when it begins, potentially granting us multiple combat phases in a turn by weaponizing our land ramp. Reaching the CMC 7 slot, we have its 2 members with Drakoseth Maw of Flames and Bane of Balaged. Drakoseth, better known as Maw of Flames, is a 7/7 flyer that, whenever it attacks, deals 4 damage to any target, and then 3 more damage to up to 2 other targets, being capable of dealing a huge amount of damage on its own and even more alongside our commander while still possessing a huge evasive body. Bane of Balaged is a 7/5 that has the defending player exile 2 permanents whenever it attacks, serving as an upgraded version of Annihilator that picks apart our opponent's boards, especially when doubled up by our commander. Finally, reaching the CMC 8 slot and our last creature, we have Ulamog's Crusher, an 8/8 with Annihilator 2 that has to attack every turn if able, giving us our biggest stat line and, like our other Eldrazi, forcing our opponents to sack 2 permanents per swing for a devastating top end. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Skipping to the CMC 2 slot, we have a pair of removal spells with Wilt and Destructive Revelry, both of which destroy an artifact or enchantment, the former being able to be cycled for 2 instead, and the latter burning the owner of the destroyed card for 2, both serving as decent back or removal tools with upside. Moving to the CMC 3 slot, we have some more removal options with Beast Within, Chaos Warp, and Krosan Grip. Beast Within destroys target permanent and gives its controller a 3/3 to replace it, making it a staple removal spell to deal with almost any type of threat with only a minor downside. Chaos Warp shuffles target permanent back into its owner's deck, then has them reveal the top card of their deck, allowing them to put it into play for free if it's a permanent, making it a fair bit more risky to use than the previous entry, but still very much worth it due to the amount of threats it's capable of dealing with. Krosan Grip destroys an artifact or enchantment and has split second, giving us another back row removal tool, though this one is nearly impossible for our opponents to respond to. Then we close out this slot with Cloth's Will, an X spell that either deals X damage to all creatures without flying, or destroys X artifacts or enchantments, making it a scalable front row or back row board wipe all at instant speed for maximum flexibility. Finally, we skip to the CMC 5 slot and our last instant with Return of the Wild Speaker, which has us either draw cards equal to the greatest power among any non-human creature we control, or gives all our non-human creatures +3/+3 until end of turn, serving as both an instant speed card draw effect and an instant speed AoE pump effect, both of which work nicely for our build. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Skipping to the CMC 2 slot, we start off with a pair of ramp spells with Rampant Growth and Farseek, both of which put a land from our deck into play tapped, the former being limited to basics, while the latter can fetch up any non-forest land with a basic land type, including some of our duals, both serving as staple land ramp in our colors. Then last in this slot we have Savage Twister, an X spell that deals X damage to each creature, giving us another scalable board wipe that can leave some of our board intact after the dust settles. The CMC 3 slot is up next with its trio of ramp spells, those being Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, and Nissa's Pilgrimage, all three searching our deck for 2 lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into our hand, the first 2 being limited to basics, while the latter can only search for basic forests, but can search for 3 forests instead of 2 if we have 2 or more instants or sorceries in our bin when we cast it, giving us some more staple green land ramp to make sure we get to our bigger spells before our opponents. The CMC 4 slot then brings us its pair of entrants with Harmonize and Relentless Assault. Harmonize has us draw 3 cards, making it a straightforward form of card advantage that's not reliant on our board state to replenish our hand. Relentless Assault untaps all our creatures and gives us an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase, serving as a straightforward and cheap way to get an extra combat phase without jumping through any additional hoops or being attached to a body that can be removed. Moving on to the CMC 5 slot, we have another pair of entries with Creeping Renaissance and Escape to the Wilds. Creeping Renaissance has us choose a permanent type and returns all cards of the chosen type from our graveyard back to our hand, as well as having flashback for 5 and double green, giving us a way to recur our creatures twice throughout the course of the game in the event our board gets wiped or we lose too many creatures with our reckless attacks. Escape to the Wilds exiles the top 5 cards of our deck and allows us to play them until the end of the next turn, giving us an additional land drop as well, giving us a substantial amount of card advantage for the cost, coupled with even more time to play the exiled cards and even throwing in some additional land ramp to boot. Finally, reaching the CMC 7 slot, we have our final sorcery with Fury of the Hoard, which lets us cast it by exiling 2 red cards from our hand instead of paying its mana cost, and grants us an additional combat phase and main phase, serving as another combat phase enabler with the added bonus of being able to be cast while being completely tapped out to help us close out games out of nowhere. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. The CMC 1 slot starts us off with 2 entrants, those being Footfall Crater and Font of Fertility. Footfall Crater is an aura that enchants a land and lets us tap said land to grant target creature haste and trample until end of turn, giving us a cheap way to ensure our creatures can swing in immediately upon being summoned and get over blockers when needed. Font of Fertility lets us pay 1 a green and sack it to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped, serving as another land ramp source that can hit the board early to help us get our mana curve going. Skipping to the CMC 3 slot, we start off with Garruk's Uprising, Fires of Yavimaya, and Rhythm of the Wild. Garruk's Uprising grants all our creatures trample, draws us a card when it ETBs if we control a creature of power 4 or greater, and draws us a card whenever a creature of power 4 or greater ETBs under our control, pulling double duty as a way to grant our creatures trample as well as granting us card advantage as we start playing our bigger creatures. Fires of Yavimaya grants all our creatures haste and can be sacked to grant target creature +2/+2 until end of turn, giving us another AoE haste enabler and a one-time combat trick when the haste is no longer required. Rhythm of the Wild prevents our creatures from being countered and grants all our creatures Riot, serving as both a silver bullet against counter-focused builds and a means to make our creatures hasty or bigger as they come into play. Finally, reaching our last enchantment, we have Druid's Repository, which gets a charge counter whenever a creature we control attacks, and lets us remove a charge counter from it to generate a mana of any color, letting us stockpile a huge amount of mana alongside our commander to be used to cast our bigger spells or pump into our abilities throughout the course of the game. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Skipping to the CMC3 slot and our only artifact, we have Lifecrafter's Bestiary, which scries 1 on each of our upkeeps and lets us pay a green whenever we cast a creature spell to draw a card, giving us another source of card advantage that synergizes well with our large creature base and adding in some recurring card selection as a bonus. That's it for our artifacts, so let's move on to our Planeswalkers. Our only Planeswalker joins us in the CMC4 slot, that being Domri Chaosbringer, who comes into play with 5 loyalty and has the following abilities. His +1 generates a red or green mana, and if that mana is spent on a creature, it grants that creature Riot. His -3 lets us look at the top 4 cards of our deck, revealing up to 2 creatures from among them to put into our hand while sending the rest to the bottom of the deck in a random order. And his -8 gives us an emblem that creates a 4/4 token with trample on every end step, providing this build with quite a bit of utility as a ramp source that further empowers our creatures, a card advantage source to dig for more bodies to put into play, and an ultimate that, while rarely reached, can outright flood the board with big bodies to help us grind out the game. That covers our Planeswalker, so let's move on to the land base. Starting with our mana lands, we have Command Tower, which taps for any color in our commander's color identity. Cinder Glade, which comes into play tapped unless we control 2 or more basic lands, taps for either of our colors and counts as both a mountain and a forest. Game Trail, which comes into play tapped unless we reveal a mountain or forest from our hand and taps for either of our colors. Highland Forest, which comes into play tapped, taps for either of our colors and counts as a mountain and a forest. Temple of Abandon, which comes into play tapped, taps for both our colors and scries 1 when it ETBs. Myriad Landscape, which comes into play tapped, taps for a colorless and we can pay 2 and sack it to put 2 of the same basic land from our deck into play tapped. And finally, Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sack to put a basic land from our deck into play tapped. The first half of our utility lands then give us Kessig Wolfrun and Skarg the Rage Pits, both of which tap for a colorless and grant a creature trample, the former doing so by tapping it and paying X a red and a green, pumping the creature by +X/+0 until end of turn, while the latter does so by tapping it and paying a red and a green, pumping the creature by +1/+1 until end of turn instead, making them both serviceable and repeatable ways to get our creatures through blockers and pumped from the relative safety of a land slot. Then we end our utility lands with Ghost Quarter and Scavenger Grounds. Ghost Quarter taps for a colorless and we can tap it and sack it to destroy target land, giving its controller a basic from their deck to replace it, making it a good source of spot removal for our opponent's utility lands. Scavenger Grounds taps for a colorless and we can pay 2, tap it and sack it to exile all cards from all graveyards, making it a potent piece of AoE graveyard hate to combat against graveyard-focused decks. Lastly, we're running 12 mountains and 12 forests as our basics to fill out our land base. So now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 38 creatures including the commander, 7 instants, 11 sorceries, 6 enchantments, 1 artifact, 1 planeswalker, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 34 cards with attack trigger effects, 5 cards that grant extra combat phases, 5 cards that grant haste, and 5 cards that grant trample, leaving us with a huge amount of effects that benefit from our commander's attack trigger doubling effect, as well as multiple means to swing in more times than normal while bypassing summoning sickness and punching through our opponent's blockers. For general deck stats, we have 14 ramp sources, 10 card draw sources, 11 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes, giving us fairly standard rates across the board for our general stats. Looking at our mana curve, we have 3 1-drops, 11 2-drops, 17 3-drops, 13 4-drops, 10 5-drops, 6 6-drops, 3 7-drops, and 1 8-drop, giving us a mid-range curve that has aggressive ramp and bodies to establish a board state early while still having high CMC creatures that will carry us throughout the mid and late game. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.56, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, more attack triggers are always good additions. Deathgorger Scavenger, for example, is a good source of graveyard hate that can pump itself or gain us life as it exiles our opponent's bins. Hellrider is a good way to get extra damage into our opponent's life totals, especially on wide boards. And Siege Dragon is another good top end to serve as a recurable one-sided board wipe on a big body. Mage Slayer is another great addition to take chunks out of our opponent's life totals on every swing, while Hanaware Garrison and Hanaware Battlements are fine additions on their own, but are much better when combined to form Hanaware the Writhing Township for the big body and spawning of 4 3/2s on every swing alongside our commander. For upgrades, Ilharg the Razeboar is a difficult to remove threat that lets us temporarily cheat creatures into play. Sword of the Animist gives us a huge amount of ramp when doubled up on. Beastmaster's Ascension provides a huge stat boost to all our creatures when it comes online. Kaluth Unrivaled Ancient can get us a huge amount of mana per swing. Scourge of the Throne is a large evasive threat that can easily grant us extra turns. Colonian Hydra can get exponentially bigger at a terrifying rate alongside our commander. Elder Gargaroth gives us a spectacular array of abilities every time it swings in. Pathbreaker Ibex provides our board with a potent overrun effect every time it attacks. And Goldspan Dragon gives us another big evasive body that gives us a whole lot of ramp in the form of treasure. Finally, Kozilek Butcher of Truth and Ulamog the Infinite Gyre give us some potent top ends, ensuring that they pick apart our opponent's boards with their Annihilator 4 as quickly as their price picks apart our wallets. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, some more thanks are in order as this channel has surpassed its 1100 sub mark. As usual, thank you for all your continued support as this channel would be unable to grow without it. Moving on to the results of last week's poll, it looks like the Frost Giant Storvald was able to climb his way up from silver to gold to earn himself a Cut Rate Commander episode, so look forward to the Jarl in an upcoming build. Moving on to this week's poll, let's make some adjustments to the roster to let some of the monocolored commanders take center stage. That means this week's poll will be featuring Zalto, Fire Giant Duke, Asmodeus the Archfiend, and Oswald Fiddlebender. Let me know in the comments which of these 3 commanders you would like to see an upcoming episode on. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.